We are now going to discuss paper number 264, which is titled The Dutch Connection of the Pilgrim Fathers. Very interesting topic. The general history sees the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers in 1620 in Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts, as the foundation of the United States. They are considered as people from England that sailed to the Promised Land for a new future. However, few actually know that the Pilgrim Fathers are tied to Holland in an everlasting way that cannot be neglected. Their true history sheds a surprising light on the faith of these founding fathers. It also gives an insight in the persecution that existed in Protestant England under Queen Elizabeth I. Very extensive paper here, very in detail, well researched. It's all truthful history. We've got about 18 pages. All right, Wade, I'll let you take over now from the first subheading. History is a monumental lie.
Yes, well, they've done their best to disguise the history of the Church of God and the Sabbatarian system from Christ and the Apostles. It was Christ and the Apostles that established the Church, and we've seen the movement out of Jerusalem in 30 CE under the directions of Christ, and how they went. Linus, who was a prince of Britain, went to Rome, and he was sent there by Christ, who ordained him, and Aristobulus, who was sent with him, and there were 3 others of the 70 sent to Rome. But Aristobulus went on to Britain, and he established the church on the 12 hides of land given to the church by Arviragus, the uncle of Linus, and the grandson-in-law of Joseph of Arimathea in Glastonbury. Now, we saw on that history how they went through, and then once the Angles entered England with the Saxons following the Jutes after the move of the Parthian horde into the northwest of Europe and then on into Britain, they didn't have to conquer their way into Britain. They were invited there because the church was Christian, but it was Celtic, and the relationships of these people were known by the people in Britain and themselves, and they'd been prepared by Peter and Andrew and the other apostles in Parthia before the Anglo-Saxons and the Parthian horde, through with all the tribes, including the Israelite groups that had been placed in among them by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. So they'd been there and they were totally absorbed by the 2nd century AD. So they came in and they established the system, but Ethelbert's wife was a French princess who was a Catholic, and in 597 she wrote to the Pope and asked for a Catholic, and Augustine later of Canterbury came into Britain and they baptised the Angles at a midwinter fire ceremony in December at the solstice, where they used to jump fires as a pagan system, and they sprinkled them. They didn't baptise them, they sprinkled them, and they became Athanasian Christians. What happened then was that they continued on to the Synod of Whitby, and in the Synod of Whitby at 663, the Sabbatarian Church then began to be suppressed among the Celts. So the Celtic Church changed, and from that time onwards we see the development of the suppression of the Sabbatarian system, both in Britain and in Europe. That then went on in conflicts through to the conquest of Britain under the William the Conqueror in 1070. Now in 1070, that was 4 years after 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, England was still in quite significant turmoil at that time, so a lot of the Sabbath keepers moved into Britain because they had a chance to escape the persecutions that were emerging in France and Germany under the Trinitarian systems. And they came in and established themselves between 1070 onwards through past the Siege of La Rochelle and the movements of tribes in from the 13th century into Britain into the 1400s. And there are many people in Britain, many families who are staunch, loyal subjects of the British who are actually Sabbatarians who escaped these persecutions in Europe. And it's important to understand that. Now, they went on being persecuted, and there were a number of councils. Now, what we've done in this work is list all of the activities and the chronology of events of the English dissenters from 663 into 1070, and then from there onwards we go in through and organise the various incidents and the Albigensian Crusades, the King Henry II, for instance, in 1160, ordered the Paulicians at Oxford to be branded on their foreheads. They executed the Pauliani or the Publiani at Oxford from 1192. So the persecutions of the Sabbatarians was a very serious problem. And these Normans were staunch defenders of the Roman system, and they used it to establish their feudal system, which Rome supported. And they enslaved the English, the Anglo-Saxon people in Britain, with this system of slavery and serfdom they brought in, supported by the Trinitarian church system. And it was enslaving our people. And nobody really understands just the level of problems that occurred under the Norman and Trinitarian systems in Britain. And it's important that we understand that, because we had the problems from the Angles and Saxons when they became Trinitarians. They persecuted the Celtic Church, but it got worse under the Normans, and the Angles and Saxons themselves were persecuted under the Normans. This time frame is listed through here all the way through to through the centuries, from the arrival of the Normans through to the events that were important in terms of the interactions between the Sabbath-keeping churches and the Trinitarian systems, and how the Trinitarians persecuted them. And it went on right through. This didn't cease all the way through from the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, and the Anabaptists. They were called Anabaptists because they were rebaptizing people. They didn't accept this infant baptism of the Trinitarians. it was an anathema to the Church of God over 2,000 years. Baptism had to be as an adult at 20 years of age, repentant of sin. That was the standard form, and the Sabbatarian system has always taught that as its standard doctrine. Now, they were then termed Anabaptists because of that doctrine, as well as Sabbatarians, and we've gone through this business of different names everywhere to try and break them up and appear that they weren't a standard organised structure of Sabbatarians following the Church of God in opposition to these Baal-worshipping Gnostics who adopted Sunday, Christmas and Easter as their doctrines.
Right.
And they were all had heaven and hell as a doctrine. They were all going to heaven when they died. That's not a Christian doctrine, not a Christian faith, and it still is not a Christian faith. Anyone who says when they die they go to heaven is not a Christian. Now, so we take all this through, and even Henry VIII persecuted the Anabaptists. It's important that we understand that the Catholic system, the Trinitarian system, was in opposition to Sabbath keeping. So Sabbath, there was a big conflict in England under Henry VIII about whether the church in the Reformation would keep Sunday or Sabbath.
Right.
And they wanted to return to Sabbath keeping at the Reformation, but they wouldn't let it happen. The Sunday worshippers, because of the Catholics and the influence of the Catholic Church still, even in the Reformation in England, stopped Sabbath keeping from being implemented. And they stopped the Passover from being implemented. They stopped the feasts. They stopped the calendar of the church and the biblical temple calendar from being implemented in Britain.
Right.
In fact, they didn't allow Sabbath to even get established to get on to the rest of the calendar.
Right, under extreme persecution. And,
yes, under extreme persecution.
Death, and yes, terrible.
Now, this list, it would be tedious to read each of the problems out of the persecutions in England, but they're there year after year after year as showing just what happened. And it went up through to 1593, and on May 29th, 1593, John Penry was executed. And he was a great Sabbatarian. So in 1593, after the execution of John Penry, the exodus of the Southwark Church to Holland started. And there was a big area in Southwark, just south of London, and from the Thames south, where the Sabbatarians were entrenched, and they began this resurgent movement for the restoration of the Sabbath-keeping churches in Britain. Now, that was then when they began to be persecuted, and they found that they had to leave Surrey and England, and the other groups came in with them and went to Holland.
Right.
That's when the movement of the Sabbatarians into other areas and finally to the United States of America began. And it's the Pilgrim Fathers of the United States of America were Sabbatarian Anabaptists. Don't let anyone tell you they weren't. and they were all Unitarians, keeping the Sabbath and the food laws, and they went to America from Holland via Britain on British ships. They hired the Speedwell and the Mayflower to go to Britain from Holland. They went to Holland because they were given more freedom and allowed to survive. They were given refuge by the Dutch in Holland.
Right.
And that's important to note. That was a great phase in the development of the church. And we had been moving under the Palatinate persecutions. The Roman Catholics were persecuting the Sabbatarians and the Protestants in the Palatinate, and they had to be got out into Britain, and they were taken by Sir Cox of Surrey across into England and established, he had warehouses on the Thames. He was a wealthy man, and he had warehouses on the Thames. So what he did was he converted the warehouses to temporary accommodation for all the Palatinate Anabaptists and Protestants under persecution by the Catholics, and he brought them across. Queen Anne was the sovereign, and he brought them across under her patronage, and he saved massive amounts of German, the Palatinate people, all the Protestants and those Anabaptists who were under persecution and being killed. And who knows how many people Cox saved. But he was knighted by Queen Anne for that. But they were then in the Thames in Surrey, and that's where the Anabaptists then had moved, and they became a much bigger organisation in Surrey, and then moved across out of Britain into Holland because they were being persecuted by these Trinitarians in Britain.
Well, what a wonderful fellow.
Yeah, he's a great man. Yeah,
to protect them, but he's like an Oscar Schindler type. That what a movie could be made out of this fellow.
Yes. What happened then was that they chartered the Speedwell and the Mayflower, and the Speedwell began taking on water.
Right, I remember the story, yeah.
Yeah, so they had to put back to Plymouth, and they then had to transship to the Mayflower, reorganise, and then they all left on the Mayflower, and they left the Speedwell in England.
Right, yeah.
So that's then, they then went to the across the Atlantic to the Americas, and they landed at Plymouth Rock, and it was called Plymouth Rock because they left from Plymouth. Right. When they had to transship. Mm-hmm. So all of these names are connections to put the church together. Now, America was established by Sabbatarians, and what they did was they had to borrow money in order to go as a business venture to America. So minders were sent with them who were Trinitarians, and these minders then went back and then organised charters and shipments of Trinitarians to the Americas as well.
Right.
And that's when the persecutions of the
Followed them.
yes, of the Sabbatarians,
What bad
that
luck.
under the Blue Laws and these Trinitarians then began persecuting them in America.
Oh no.
So we will then deal with America and the establishment. This was a mark. This point in time was the mark and the start of the 400 years of the unmerited blessings of Abraham's legacy.
Right.
And it went the 400 years when they established the colony in Rhode Island. They had the first Thanksgiving, and that was 400 years ago from December 2023.
Right.
And the reason the 400 years is significant is because God told Abraham that he would put his progeny, which hadn't even been born yet, into Egypt for 430 years, and we'll deal with that in this 400 years legacy.
Right.
But that was the beginning of it, and that was the beginning of the measurement of the blessings of Abraham given to Israel. And it was done through the Sabbatarian Christians who were the Pilgrim Fathers. They weren't Trinitarians at all. They kept Sabbath, and they did not keep Christmas, and they did not allow Christmas as a festival to be kept in America when they arrived.
Right.
All of this is very important to the establishment of the blessings of Israel through America and the British Commonwealth. And it was happening right through the British Commonwealth under the organisation of the British government at the direction of God. This was happening, and he used God's people, the Sabbatarian system, to establish the blessings in America, and he used Holland as a refuge, the Netherlands as a refuge amongst the Fries and the Dutch, in order to reorganize them so that they could then charter ships and take them to the New World, so that there could be Abraham's blessings conferred on our people.
Right, yep.
And it was right round the world, and we'll talk about that on the 400 years of Abraham's blessing. Now, all of this went on. You'll see in this work the detailed organisation into Holland, into the Netherlands, and how they were organised, how the Pilgrim Fathers were organised, how the Dutch officials dealt with them, how the people, the characters involved, such as William Bradford and others, were developed. Greenwood and his organisation and structure, how the organisation, the chartering and the Mayflower, sailing finally from Plymouth to New England, how that occurred, what the structure was. This is important history. And if you're an American, you should be really concerned with this.
Right.
And certainly all of us should be concerned. Every Sabbatarian in the world should be concerned with this. And these things happening and the development of America then had an effect, because the American Revolution forced the settlement of Australia, because they couldn't take the convicts to America anymore.
Right.
From 1776, because they'd been taking every prisoner and every social discontent in Britain, including the Monmouth rebels in the West under James Duke of Monmouth. They shipped them all to the Americas, to the Caribbean and to the United States. And the United States was peopled by prisoners. And just remember that. The Americans don't even know that they were a convict colony in the first place.
Yeah.
And they look down and you say, oh, the Australians, we were a convict colony for 100 years.
Right.
Oh, you know, they're subhuman. But the Americans were a convict colony for 250 years. Where do we go from there?
Yeah, and like you say, that's history.
It's history.
They like to lie about it, put it away and hide it, but it's history.
Yeah, it's history, and this is documenting the history. So there's no hiding from the history, and it's important that you all understand that. And these chronologies will tell you everything. And how they suppressed Sabbatarianism from the Synod of Whitby in 663, and they forced them underground in the Celtic Church. Don't let anyone tell you Britain was founded by any sort of Trinitarianism, any sort of Sunday worshipping Christianity. It was not. The people, the Celtic Church that was established by Aristobulus at the orders of Jesus Christ was Sabbatarian, quartodeciman, keeping the food laws and adult baptism. That's what the facts were. And that's what the Christian Church was in Britain until it was suppressed by these Trinitarian heretics. And it will be put back there under the Christ in the next few years. And all of that system will come to an end. And the temple calendar and the laws of God will be reintroduced to Britain and the whole world at the point of a sword.
Right. Yeah.
And Wayne, I was going to ask you that, we learn a lot from history if we're honest about it. One of the things that I found in the chronicle of the events is a situation where they were thrown into the clink.
Oh yeah, the clink's jail.
And the church jail. And it's a saying now that's used a lot.
Yes.
Keep it up, you go into the clink.
Well,
Yeah, that's right.
The Germans used to use that.
Yeah,
That's where they used to put the Sabbatarians in Britain. If they
Right,
were-
into the clink.
Into the clink, yeah.
So it was
Was an actual prison.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
And that term originally came from
The persecution of
The clink, the name.
people who were putting them into
Right.
the clink. Yeah.
Yeah, so they actually named their prison the clink.
right.
Clink.
Yeah,
So, and it's amazing how when you go through some of those words stand out, you think,
for sure.
oh, that's where that came from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well used by Hogan's heroes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is right. And it just goes on. And they went through persecuting us for denying the Trinity. And they stopped executing us in 1661 to 1665.
Right.
And in 1668, they put William Penn in the Tower of London for denying the doctrine of the Trinity. So they didn't hang him. Fortunately, they'd stopped hanging them in 1665.
Right.
But they were still they put William Penn in prison.
Yeah, they were still persecuting that true church, weren't they? And as we've discussed before,
Yeah.
the fact that they were in some ways overzealous in their history of it and recording it
Yeah.
to say, well, these people were wrong because they kept Saturday, these people were wrong because they kept these strange holy days and they eat clean and food, is an indication that we can actually track where the true church was
Yes.
all the way through.
Yes, the records of what they were imprisoning us for and persecuting us for shows what our doctrines were.
Right. Well,
And they're constant doctrines all the way. It's what we are.
right. Yeah.
And the CCG doctrines in the 21st century from 1994 mirror exactly the Sabbatarian churches of God for 1900 years, up until the 20th century when the Sardis system wrecked it.
Right.
Under Duggar and Armstrong and under the Ellen G. White and the Laodicean systems, under the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses. They wrecked the faith.
Yep.
But we know what they were up through until the 20th century.
Well, look, the information is found, all this information found in paper 264, the Dutch connection of the Pilgrim Fathers. Again, it's a fairly easy read, but very intense in its history, in its revealing of what that history actually means to the American people, British people, in fact, the people all over the world. And again, it shows that the one true church, under the one true God, had the one true belief. They were all of one mind. They kept the same feast, they kept the same Sabbaths.
New moons, the whole lot.
The whole lot.
Yep.
Yes, and our history is identifiable, and we have done 40 years of research to put all this together, and all of the history of the church, 122, 170, and all those series. This paper, all of the history of the church is there, verifiable, absolutely authentic, academically, cannot be refuted, and the fact that it was not done when we had the power to do it under the Sardis system is an absolute disgrace. And the fact that the Sabbatarian, the churches of God, under Duggar and Armstrong and under the Adventists and under the Jehovah's Witnesses is a public disgrace, and that's why those churches were declared dead and spewed from the mouth of God.
Too right.
And that's who they are. They have the name that they're living, but they are dead. And we'll deal with that on a continuing basis from now. But if you have a desire to be in the first resurrection, you have to repent, and you have to re-establish the faith and the testimony of Jesus Christ as necessary to become one of the saints of God from Revelation 12:17 and 14:12. That's your requirement, that's your test. And if you haven't done it, you're in trouble. You're not in the first resurrection, and you'll have to repent at the return of the Messiah just to stay alive into the millennium.
Right, so we hope to see you all soon.
Yes, let's hope that that's the case, and there's plenty of study for you. I find that it's going to be very difficult to get you through all of this until the Messiah comes, or before the Messiah comes.